Hello, you're watching Eye on Africa. I'm James Creedon. These are our headlines from across the continent. This evening, violence has erupted in South Sudan with hundreds reportedly dead since the beginning of the week. This after inter-ethnic violence erupted. Now, a fragile peace deal is now on the brink of collapse. We'll get some analysis on that situation at the top of the show. We'll also take a look at how COVID-19 is disrupting the provision of healthcare for those suffering from HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. And Ethiopian migrant workers are finding themselves in increasingly difficult circumstances in Lebanon, where a deepening economic crisis has seen domestic staff laid off. Thanks for watching Eye on Africa. Now, hundreds of civilians were killed in a series of tribal clashes in South Sudan over the past week. The violence took place in several villages in Jonglei State, this according to the Red Cross. 3 aid workers were also amongst the dead. Now, Jonglei's vast territory has been a theatre of ethnic clashes for decades. Tensions have persisted over control of land and livestock. Violence has intensified, though, in recent months after 10 states were created in an administrative shake-up. Now, for more on the situation, we can cross to Professor Awol Allo, Senior Law Lecturer at Keele University in the UK. Thank you for talking to us, Professor. You have extensive knowledge of the situation, and we're hearing about confusion over the appointment of governors in this administrative shake-up. Reuters has spoken about a power vacuum. What more can you tell us?
You're absolutely right that the delay in the appointment of governors in the region somewhat contributed, but this has been a persistent feature of Sudanese politics until very recently, when the current vice president, was appointed as vice president. We had a very long history of politically motivated violence, but what we see now is a slightly different kind of violence, where you don't necessarily have a direct involvement of political actors or armed movements, but ethnically motivated violence between the various communities. So it's not simply, I think, the question of a delay in the appointment of governors, but much broader question that has to do with resources as well.
So from what I understand, the administration of the country, South Sudan, independence from Sudan in 2005, and you had some 10 different regions, which were then broken up into 32 regions in recent years in order to match the ethnic divisions. And then it was brought back to 10 regions. Now, you would think that regions reflecting ethnic divisions might help the situation, but apparently reversing that has worsened matters. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It is really a very difficult situation, especially when you constitute a highly diverse political community into a new state. You will have a range of difficulties, including the kind of violence that we see in South Sudan. The question of whether or not you create a state that kind of reflects the identities of particular ethnic groups is a political choice that has to be made. So several countries in that region have made precisely that kind of choice. So if you look at Ethiopia, for example, it has a multinational federal system where ethnicity is central to everything. Somalia has the same system. South Sudan, a very diverse country, followed in the footsteps of Ethiopia and Somalia. But the problem is that while addressing the demand for identity, the demand for recognition and representation is a very important one at the theoretical level, in practice, it makes it very difficult to organize and structure a state system that actually functions in a society that does not really have a very long history of dealing with states and administrative structures.
So you have these sort of ongoing ethnic difficulties and rivalries, and then on top of that, you had a civil war between the two major parties, and that was supposedly a peace deal was supposedly kind of signed on that. Well, it was signed, but peace was supposedly re-established in 2018, and now we're seeing this descent into unrest. So where do we stand now with that 2018 peace deal after 5 years of civil war?
Absolutely, and I think the challenge that you have in a multinational, multi-ethnic communities is that the elite bargain that leads to some kind of peace deal do not necessarily reflect the wishes and the desires of people on the ground. People on the ground do not necessarily subscribe to those broader deals that are made at the political level. So Sudan is a highly diverse country, and the civil war over the course of the last 7 years was mainly to forces between Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir.
And just very quickly, do you think there's any end in sight to this ongoing pattern over decades of conflict? If that peace deal has led to nothing, is there any hope for the people in South Sudan that there will be an end to this constant conflict?
I don't think the current violence as such threatens the peace deal that was reached in February. The peace deal is still holding. But obviously, if you continue to see these internal frictions and battles between the various communities leading to the death and destruction of so many lives, of course, that's going to affect the peace deal. But currently, the peace deal is holding. It's not, the violence at the moment is not necessarily directly related to the peace deal itself. It's to do with other actors, for example, that were not brought on board while the peace deal was made, and also broader questions around the resources.
All right, well, an awful situation. Hundreds of thousands dead in the last 4 or 5 years as a result of this, millions displaced. So hopefully there will be some end to this pattern. Thanks for that, Professor Awol Allo from in Kiel University in the UK. Now, concerns have been expressed about how those living with HIV in Africa would be affected should they contract COVID-19. Now, while current treatments mean HIV patients live normal lives, many do not have reliable access to life-saving medication. The World Health Organization and UNAIDS have sounded the alarm over the combined risk of both viruses. According to these agencies, 500,000 HIV-positive people in sub-Saharan Africa could die in the next 2 years due to lack of medication and the stress put on healthcare systems because of COVID-19. Elodie Cousin and Bastien Renouy report.
Consolata is severely ill and is not able to get out of bed. She and her husband are seropositive for HIV. Although antiretroviral treatment is free in Kenya, they have almost run out of pills. For fear of contracting the COVID-19 virus, they don't feel comfortable going to the hospital. The World Health Organization and the UN's HIV/AIDS agency fear that an increasing number of patients in sub-Saharan Africa are avoiding hospitals or don't have access to their medication. Using a mathematical model, they estimate that 500,000 people could die as a result of this situation.
If people disrupt accessing treatment services, let's say for 3 months or maybe 6 months, it's a model. It's not a perfect kind of figure, but it can clearly show you the trend as to how it can aggravate the health situation of people living with HIV.
Kenya has had to adapt. This clinic welcomes a very limited number of patients. To avoid crossing paths, they come in by appointment, one at a time. Social workers now conduct consultations over the phone.
I wanted to confirm about Catherine.
They now have to reassure patients on a daily basis.
The medicine doesn't come from Kenya. The medicine is secured from other places in the world. And right now, logistics are so hard everywhere in the world. So people are scared of, might the ARVs run out?
The UN worries that a shortage of antiretrovirals might affect the continent if the pandemic lasts. For now, though, the situation in Kenya is manageable. To reduce how often they are forced to leave their homes, patients can now collect medicine for up to 6 months of treatment.
OK, time now for some other stories from across the continent. Businesses across Botswana are to reopen as the country continues to relax its lockdown. Schools are also to reopen under strict guidelines. The country was in lockdown for 48 days and started easing those restrictions 2 weeks ago. The extensive measures likely helped curb the spread of COVID-19, with only 1 fatality registered and 29 cases recorded in total. Now, who will replace Burundi's long-standing leader Pierre Nkurunziza? The country went to the polls on Wednesday, but results are still not fully tallied. More than 5 million voters were asked to choose between Nkurunziza's hand-picked successor, that's Evariste Ndayishimiye, the main opposition competitor Agathon Rwasa, and 5 other candidates. Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa has sacked one of his ministers on Wednesday after he took to Twitter to mock 3 women who had been abducted last week. The 3 members of the opposition MDC party were later found having been abducted and assaulted with suspicion of government involvement. That incident led to international outrage and condemnation. The information minister in question, called Energy Mutodi, had claimed in his tweet that the 3 women had been enjoying a romantic getaway during their disappearance. Now, as Lebanon grapples with a very serious economic crisis, many well-to-do families have begun to abandon their domestic staff, as some have literally ended up on the street. Now, many of these undocumented workers are Ethiopian. They've been left to fend for themselves or to try to find a way back to their home country. Often they have no legal paperwork. Laurent Berstecker has more.
Massed outside the Ethiopian consulate in Beirut, these women are all hoping to return home. Sophia used to work as a cleaning lady for a Lebanese family, but was recently let go by her employer. As Lebanon's economic crisis continues to deepen, many families cannot afford to pay their home employees. Like Sophia, a majority of these foreign workers end up in the streets without any legal documents or resources. Faced with the situation, Lebanese authorities have begun organizing repatriation flights to Ethiopia and Egypt, but the ticket costs around $500. Outside of the Ethiopian embassy, Lebanese families were trying to help their employees to book a seat. There are currently around 250,000 foreign domestic workers in Lebanon, most of them hailing from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. Under the sponsorship system known as kafala, many have seen their passports confiscated by recruitment agencies. Isolated, underpaid, and sometimes physically abused, they're often forced to work in slavery-like conditions.
All right, that's all for this edition of Eye on Africa. Thanks for watching.